sometimes I wonder how many more models I could build and how many more videos I would be able to produce if I would stop filming those intricate intros for my videos. But I really enjoy those, so I guess you have to live with that in the future as well. And this time there's also a surprise in the end of this video, so stay tuned for that. Hi and welcome back to my channel. My name is Falk and in this video I will be painting the MiniArt Lanz Bulldog D8506. Like probably most of you, I have to admit that over the years of modeling, a couple of shelf queens accumulated on my display shelf. Models I started building and never finished, or models I finished building and maybe also primed, but I never got around to painting them for whatever reason. And in my last live stream I asked my viewers if you would like to see a shorter video where I only paint one of those models. No build video obviously, since those models are already built. But I can show you the whole painting process, and from what I understand that's the more interesting part to most of you. So here we are with the first one in this series. The original kit contains this tractor, a trailer, a couple of crates and barrels and 2 German army figures. But I quickly decided that I wanted to do a civilian scheme on this one. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The most important one is I grew up in the German countryside, and as a kid I've seen a lot of those tractors on classic tractor and car meetings, and I really enjoyed the look and the special sound of those tractors. So that's why I decided let's go with a blue paint scheme that you could probably spot on an original one or even on a restored version that you could see nowadays on a classic tractor meeting. When I started to post the first pictures of this model over on my Patreon page, where my patrons get regular updates on what I'm building at the moment, I got a couple of comments and messages from one of my Patreons, namely Ralph. This kit is also on his shelf in the black primer coat without a paint job so far, because he can't decide on what scheme to use and he isn't that fond of the military scheme either. And by the way, Ralph is one of my Patreons since day one and I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. So he's relatively new to the hobby and he asked me if I could tell a bit more about my process how to develop a paint scheme like this. And there isn't a real answer to that, unfortunately, but I like to give you a bit more insight in my decision-making process when doing something like that. My first and probably the most obvious step is to look at reference pictures. Online you can find a lot of pictures of those tractors, historical photos and black and white, but also a lot of modern photos from restored tractors and tractors still in use, and those help a lot. Also, for most subjects it's not that hard to find a community who has a lot of knowledge about this topic. In most cases online would be your best bet, but for this tractor I also had the option to ask a couple of people I knew in reality who are into vintage tractors, and often those communities can provide a lot of important information about stuff like the paint scheme or the paint color of the current subject. The most valuable information in this case was, in the 1930s and 40s, those tractors often came without any paint, just in a coat of primer, so the farmer had the chance to leave it in a coat of primer and save some money, or to paint his own paint on there to, again, save some money. But there were also official paint schemes right from the factory, and blue was one of them. And with a civilian subject like this, I also don't care about color accuracy that much. If anybody was able to paint his tractor in his own color scheme, it's quite possible that somewhere out there is a tractor in this color scheme. And if you're going to weather a vehicle or a model you build, you're also going to alter the paint a lot, so it's not that important, to me at least, to get the color exactly right as seen in a reference picture. Also, that's often the case for armor. Maybe not so much modern armor, but if you go to the German Tank Museum, for example, and you look at a bunch of dunkelgelb tanks, you can see like 10 different versions of dunkelgelb in just a couple of meters, so in my mind it's not that important to get the color exactly right. And it's way more important to get a vehicle in the end that looks good and you are proud of. However, this tractor straight from the factory was also available in a blue paint scheme, and I really like blue. So the next step for me was to bring out my collection of paints and look for a blue that I would enjoy. More often than not, there's a specific paint in my collection that starts jumping out to me, and in this case it was this Tamiya medium blue. And in the beginning of this video you could see me start painting the medium blue base coat. I thin it with a lot of Mr. Leveling thinner and start spraying it in an uneven pattern. I spray more layers on the highlight areas and less layers on the darker areas. After I was satisfied with the base coat, I started to work on the color modulation, and I started to add Tamiya XF23 light blue into my medium blue to paint in the highlights. And again I added even more Mr. Leveling thinner so I can work with very thin layers and I can build up the effect over time. In this case I went with light blue rather than white since I wanted to keep the saturation of the blue color a bit higher. But after a couple of layers I also decided to add in a bit of white in my paint to get even brighter highlights. Unfortunately, I quickly found out that the paint job became a bit too faded this way, so I then took Tamiya X14 Sky Blue and added a lot of Mr. Leveling thinner, like a 10:1 thinner to paint ratio, and sprayed a very light filter all over the model to get the saturation of the blue back. Unfortunately, the model then became a bit too blue, so I started to add Tamiya White again to do a bit more color modulation on the tractor. As you can see, for me getting to the right result is often a back and forth process, but I really enjoy that. And if something goes horribly wrong, VMS Clean Slate is a nice way to remove all the paint and start all over. And honestly, I don't mind that. After I was done with the blue areas, I went straight to the exhaust. As always, for a dark steely surface, I start out with a base coat of German grey, and then I used a sponge and different grey tones and off-white tones to stipple in some corroded steel texture. Again, reference pictures are key, and from what I know on these tractors, the exhaust normally was painted also in the base color of all the exterior parts, but they quickly started to corrode, and hot corroded steel get those really nice texture over it with a lot of white and light grey sprinkles over the darker surface, and I try to replicate that. Obviously you could also use a brush to paint in this texture, but honestly the sponge is a lot faster and I prefer that way. In this case I kept the rust texture subtle since I wanted to go with a vehicle that is maybe well used somewhere in the 1930s and not a vehicle that looks like it was rotting in a barn for the last centuries. A couple of moments ago you will also be able to see what happens when you don't remove enough paint from your sponge, and then you start getting really big splotches of paint on your model. But honestly, with a technique like this, again it's not a problem. Just take your lighter grey colors, sponge over it after removing most of the paint again with a sponge, and then you're good to go. And as you can see, I also did quite a heavy stippling, sponging, whatever, with a bluish color that matches the blue on the tractor itself, so I can create an effect of paint that flaked off from this exhaust and to show that there was the original blue paint also on this exhaust. And for the pin wash, or maybe in this case maybe more overall wash, I went with Rust Streaks by AK Interactive. This enamel paint is easily to blend with enamel thinner, so I stippled it on, let it dry for a couple of minutes, maybe like 5 minutes, and then I use heavy amounts of odorless mineral spirits to blend it all over the surface, and I try to leave more of it around the corners and smaller details like those bolt heads. And after that was done, I came in with another acrylic paint. Again a blue tone, but this time more saturated than the one I used before. What I'm doing here is maybe, let's call it reverse chipping. So normally if you're going to do light chips on a model, you take a paint that's a bit lighter than your base coat. But in this case I started out with the lighter paint and stippled that on, and after all the effects were done I came in with a bit darker and more saturated blue paint to create larger chips of paint that still have the original color that you can see all over the tractor itself. But we will get back to that topic when we arrive at the chipping for the rest of this model. And after that was done, I also came in with another enamel effect by AK Interactive, this time engine grime. Engine grime is the color I used for most of the pin wash on this model, just to get a bit more saturation, a bit more contrast going. In the darker areas and in the corners of this exhaust in this case. If you want to see me go more in detail about how I paint my exhausts, let me know down in the comments below, and maybe I can make something like a how to paint exhausts video in the future. After I was done with the exhaust, I started to work on all the other small details around the tractor. And that thing here in front of the tractor actually is the cylinder of the engine that produces this iconic sound. When I built that model, I used Tamiya putty and glue to create some heavy steel texture or casting texture on this part already. And then I used German grey as a base coat again and used the sponge to stipple on some AK Interactive 3rd generation graphite. And after that was done, I used this brush that already have seen better days and stippled on even lighter white paint to create some highlights all over the surface. The radiators were made from brass and I used AK Interactive Old Gold for that, since I like it more than the brass paint. Later I will use a heavy enamel wash over them to dull them a bit down and make them stand out less. And for the leaf springs on the front axle, I again used German grey to create a natural steel finish that then will later receive a rust wash and a couple of highlights, so it looks like raw unpainted steel. After that, it was time for the most fun but also most time consuming detail. In a lot of pictures you see those tractors have a plate in front that says Lanz Bulldog. In most cases those are in a nice red with a yellow lettering, so I tried to replicate that with the photo etch part that was included in the kit. I started out with a couple of very thin layers of red paint to build up the effect nicely, and then I came in with a very fine brush and yellow paint and started to paint in the raised lettering. Now that I'm rewatching that footage, I have to say the lettering looks a lot better in reality than on camera, fortunately. If I made a mistake, I came back in with the red paint and painted that over the yellow, and then I again used the yellow and tried to keep it on the raised detail of the photo etch part. And while that was a fun task, it was also quite time consuming and a bit nerve-wracking, and I was happy after I was finished and I decided it would be good enough. This task would have been a lot easier if the letters on the photo etch part would have been raised a bit more. The license plate was another fun and interesting task. Since this is supposed to be a military kit, MiniArt provides only decals for license plates that belong to the Wehrmacht, but as I said, I wanted to do a civilian scheme. As a solution for that, I painted the whole number plate white for the background color, and then I used a piece from the MiniArt decal sheet for the number, so that would be on the number plate. Of course, I did some research about license plates from that time period, and I thought that a B would be a nice and fitting lettering in front of the numbers on this license plate. After I was done adding the decals, I also used some white acrylic paint on the white parts of those decals to blend them in with the white paint I used for the background of the license plate. Also, go down to the comment section and try to guess for which city in Germany the B stands in the 1930s. Unfortunately, I can't show you much of the other decals, since those were in pretty hidden spots and I had to use an airbrush needle to push them into place somehow. Also, there aren't many decals on this tractor. Now it's time for the most fun part, the pin wash. Before I started with that, I also sprayed a couple of thin coats of AK Interactive satin varnish all over to get a bit of a sheen all over the model. And that will create a nice contrast with the matte earth effects I will add later to the model. Normally I only use matte varnish, and even before I do something like a pin wash, I spray a matte varnish, since I like the extra grip that a matte varnish gives the enamel paint that I put on top of it. So it's the first time for me working with a very glossy undercoat under a pin wash, and yet I'm not sure how I like it, to be honest. Of course, it's quite cool that the pin wash flows a lot better along all those edges and details, and it looks really cool, I have to admit that. But also it's way easier to clean up, which sounds like a good thing in the first moment, but I really like the extra grip that a matte varnish gives the enamel paint that I put on top of it. I feel that the matte varnish gives me more control about the blending and the removal of the enamel paint. But also, to be honest, in this case it wasn't too bad. As I said before, I wanted to keep the model fairly new and the weathering subtle, so it helped a lot that most of the pin wash was easily removed after application. But for something like a tank, I for sure will stick to the matte varnish before I start the pin wash. Applying a pin wash is something I can do all day long. I find it really enjoyable to apply the paint and to blend it and remove most of it again, and to see how all these small details start to pop. And before I forget it, for this pin wash I used AK Interactive Engine Grime. I already also used it on the exhaust a bit earlier in this video. It's not really necessary to use a product that says pin wash on the bottle, to be honest. You can use any other enamel paint as well. In most cases I put a few drops of enamel paint into a small mixing cup, and I also add a bit of mineral spirits to it, so it flows a little better around all those details. And that way you can quite easily make your own pin wash. In this case I went with the engine grime because my black pin wash was too black and my brown pin wash was a bit too brown, and engine grime for me hits the right spot between darkness and grime and dirtiness for something like this model. What I want to say with that is, you don't have to stick to the thing that's written on the bottle. Just use whatever paint you like. After all, it's all just paint again. And now that we are close to the end of the pin wash phase, you can see that I kept the lower areas a lot more dirty, and I tried to clean up the higher areas on the tractor as best as possible, while keeping a bit of contrast from the darker pin wash around details, of course. And after I was done with the pin wash, before I started the chipping, I also glued the exhaust back in place. When I built this model 1.5–2 years ago, for some reason I glued the exhaust already in place, so I had to break it off, and I again used Tamiya glue to glue it back into place after most of the painting was done. And now we get back to chipping. I told you when I did the exhaust that I used a dark blue paint and I did some reverse chipping, I guess I called it. And I did the opposite thing this time. For me, chipping is also a form of highlighting different details on the model. As you can see, I started out with a very light blue paint, and I tried to hit most of the edges and those smaller details. For one, it works like an edge highlight. This is a technique that is quite common with miniature painters and wargamers, and it makes models look cool and really highlights and accentuates the edge of a part. It might not be the most realistic technique, but after all it looks quite cool, and also does a great job to highlight any details on the model. Also, in my experience, if you make a light scratch into a painted surface, that scratch often appears a bit lighter, so I use it for one, as I said, as an edge highlight all over to get more contrast and to make details and edges pop a bit more, but also I use it as a very light version of chipping on flat surfaces of the model. After I was done with the light blue chipping, I went for a red color to simulate chips that revealed the primer underneath the blue paint. To be fair, I'm not completely sure if the original tractor also had bright red primer underneath, but I was able to find pictures and videos of a restored Lanz Bulldog, and that actually had a bright red primer underneath its blue paint, and that looked really cool in the areas where the original paint got a bit chipped and the primer was revealed, so I decided to recreate that for my model as well. And after all, the red primer color also complements very nice with the red wheels that I will put in place later on this tractor. And after I was done with the red chipping, I also again used some German grey to add some bare metal chipping in the high wear and tear areas like the trailer hitches and the front and the back, for example. And also on the front axle, where it might have hit a stone or something like that while driving over a field. And while you watch me paint the rest of the chipping, I would like to take a moment to thank you all for the amazing support. Every like, every comment and every subscriber helps this channel to grow, and in the end helps me to make more videos like this one. And of course, a special thanks to all my amazing Patreons over on patreon.com. You guys keep this channel running and your support helps me a lot in creating more videos. Over on Patreon you can get high quality pictures of my work, regular workbench updates, ad-free videos and also all the 3D files I create for my projects. So again, thank you all for your amazing support, and if you haven't subscribed yet to my channel, please subscribe to my channel, leave a like and write a comment down below. And of course also go and check out my Patreon page. There's also a lot of free stuff. I post a lot of free high quality photos after a model is finished, so you can take a better look at the model than it would be possible in this video format. Thank you so much. And I guess you know the drill by now. After I was done with the bare metal chipping, I used AK Interactive rust streaks again and blended them over the surface around the trailer hitch and stuff like that to create a slight rust effect all over the surface. Again, I try to keep the effects subtle on this model so I can create a vehicle that is well used but in a fairly good and well maintained condition. But of course on areas like this bar and the back where equipment and stuff like that would be attached, it's fine to go a little heavier on chipping and rust effects as well. After that it was time for the earth effects. Again I looked at a lot of reference material. After all, those tractors were quite slow and the ground it will later stand on is a fairly dry one, so I decided also to keep the earth effects down. I started out with Summer Kursk Earth by AK Interactive, another enamel paint. I sprayed this heavily diluted through my airbrush over the underside and also the lower sides of the model. As you can see, again I did very thin layers, some are barely visible, and in some areas unfortunately I went a bit too heavy, but since this is an enamel paint it's not that big of a deal. I was able to wipe it right away with a bit of enamel thinner without damaging the blue paint underneath. And after I was done with the first layer of enamel paint, I used the brush and mineral spirits to blend it over the surface and remove some of the paint in areas where I found the application was a bit too heavy. In cases like this I really like to flood the whole surface of my model with that enamel thinner to create a really nice and soft blend over the whole surface and some barely visible dirt stains all over. After I was done with the first layer of Summer Kursk Earth, I again did the same process with earth effects by AK Interactive and brown earth deposits as well. Again, this is another step where it's a lot of back and forth for me. I apply a bit of paint, blend and remove most of it, then I take a good look and decide if I want to do more or if I need to remove any more paint. I think if I remember correctly it took me about 5 or 6 passes with different earth effects until I was happy with the end result. The earth effects are noticeable, but I don't think that they are too heavy for a vehicle that is currently driving over a dusty field. And what I also really like is of the contrast between the more shiny blue paint because of the satin varnish and the very flat and matte areas where I applied the dust and earth effects. And I used pigments to add another small detail. Normally I'm not that big of a pigment guy and I don't really like using those, but in this case I applied a bit of pigment around the lower areas of this tractor, in the edges and on those bars in the back for example, to show a bit of earth that was lying on this tractor and didn't fall off yet. Before I went with the pigment I also tried real earth, but that looked way too heavy and grainy and large compared to the pigments I then used. And I also applied very small amounts of pigments around the side areas just to create that tiny bit more texture in those places. I also added a bit of dried seagrass by AK Interactive to look like straw, because this tractor will be driving over a freshly harvested field after all. And after I was happy with the application I then used Pigment Fixer to fix everything in place. I also used my earth effects again over the earth pigments to create a bit of color variation, but to be honest it's barely noticeable in the end, and it's fine since those areas are so small and will be mostly hidden in the end when this tractor will be sitting in its diorama. And a quick service advice, use a different brush for your enamel based pigment fixer and your enamel paints, because I had a bad reaction between those two paints for some reason. When I put the brush that I used for the pigment fixer into a bit of enamel paint, that enamel paint immediately formed a glob in the brush bristles and the brush became unusable after that. For the headlights I used Vallejo Metal Color Chrome that's easily brushed in on the inside, and then I used AK Interactive Crystal Magic Glue to glue in the clear parts that were provided in the kit. Unfortunately those didn't fit too well, so I had to do a bit of sanding to make them fit into place. Of course I should have checked that before I started painting the model, but for some reason I forgot it and I had to do it while all the paint was already applied to the model. But in the end it was not that big of a deal either. Time for one last detail, and maybe the most important one: the wheels of this tractor. I decided that the rims will be red, as seen in reference pictures, and I started out with a base coat of Hull Red by Tamiya, since it's a nice dark red brownish color that works great as a shadow color for me. And of course more color modulation. I used Tamiya X7 Red for that. It's a glossy paint and it's a bright red, and I started to add small amounts of it into the Hull Red to lighten it up and make it more reddish looking. I used this mixture as well on the inside part of the rim to get a bit more color variation going, but then I stopped there so the inside parts of the rim won't become too bright and too reddish, since those will mostly be in the shadows. And in the end I used pure X7 Red with a lot of Mr. Leveling thinner and sprayed a couple of very thin layers over the rim to create an even more bright and more rich red on the rim itself. After the rims received their base coat, it was time to focus on the rubber part of the tire, and I used AK Interactive Rubber Black for that. I hate masking with a passion, so I always brush part the rubber parts, even if it's a tank with like a million road wheels. For me that's just the easier and more enjoyable way. And if you use a brush that can keep the shape of its tip really well, it's honestly not that hard. Just turn the tire around and then carefully paint along the edge. And after I had a nice edge around the rim, I also painted the rest of the tire using my brush and Rubber Black by AK Interactive. And after the rubber parts of those tires also received their base coat, I started to work on the weathering for those wheels. Again, engine grime enamel paint around all the edges and smaller details on those rims to act as a pin wash. Blending the enamel paint wasn't so complicated either, since it's mostly a large and flat surface. The back tires have a bit more detail than the front ones, but even on those it's not that difficult. And as you can probably tell, the wheels however received a flat varnish other than the rest of the tractor. And I also decided to keep the wheels a bit more dirty compared to the rest of the tractor, since those won't probably get quite dirty when they're driving over a field for the whole day. And of course I also did some chipping, and again I used 3 different paints for that. I started out with a bright red for light chips and scratches on those rims. I then used some German grey again to show bare metal chipping. And I also used Old Rose by AK Interactive. That paint is quite pale and pinkish, and I used it to edge highlight and highlight all the small details on those rims to create a bit more contrast. As I said, nothing too fancy on the rim of those wheels. The rubber part was way more exciting for me, since I don't have that much experience with wheeled vehicles whatsoever. So again, I had a good look at a couple of references, and I noticed that the wheels get way less dirty and muddy than I expected at first. And I also already have a diorama in mind for this tractor, and as I said, that will have fairly dry ground. So I decided again to keep it a bit more subtle than you maybe would see it on something like a military vehicle or something like that was driving through heavy mud. I started out with a pin wash, or rather a heavy wash in this case, of AK Interactive dust effects all over the rubber part to bring out all the details. I then used enamel thinner and a brush to blend the dust effects over the whole surface. I also always keep a paper towel at hand to remove any excess paint. Those dust effects were then followed up with earth effects enamel paint on the outer parts of the rubber part. Again, I stippled on the paint quite heavily, and then I blended it over the whole surface. After I was done blending the paint over the surface, I again let it dry for maybe 10 to 15 minutes. After that time I came in with a cloth and I removed most of the paint left behind to keep just a hint of dust effects and earth effects in the deep parts of the tire. When the module will be placed in the diorama, I might add a bit more earth effects to the tires. Maybe some acrylic texture paint or some pigments, but I'm not sure yet. So far, in my opinion, the tires look believable, and that's good enough for now, I guess. And before I call this weathering job completely done, I added another round of pin washes. There's some nicely raised lettering on the tires stating the manufacturer and the tire size, and I wanted to bring out those details a bit more. So I applied another pin wash around those details using the dust effects again. And after they had a few minutes to dry, I used a cloth to wipe the excess away. I prefer the cloth for that, since it makes sure that there will be some paint left behind in the recesses. Essentially, I'm reversing the contrast game at this point, keeping the lower areas light and the higher areas dark, but it works and it really sells the effect, and after all, I like to show those details as well. And to finish everything off, it was time for another coat of light rose to bring back all the edges and to really highlight those and make them pop. Again, this might not be the most realistic technique, but it sure does look cool, so I like to use it a lot. Last thing that had to be done was supergluing the wheels in place. And this was a really fun project, and I'm so happy that this model finally received some paint. Again, thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to my channel, leave a comment and like this video. Also, thanks again to my amazing Patreons. Check out my Patreon page for more insights and the free high quality pictures. Regarding the now following presentation of this model, I'm sorry, but I had way too much fun creating that. Again, you can check out the high quality pictures on Patreon. Have fun with the montage, and until next time, take care.